Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists for today. First, we have Ms. Carmela Monk-Crawford, who's the editor of Message magazine. We also have with us Ms. Melissa Reed, who's the Director of Government Affairs for the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We also have Ms. Bettina Krause, who's the editor of Liberty magazine. And we have Mr. Lawrence Brown, who's the senior pastor of the Queensboro Seventh-day Adventist Church in New York City. I want to thank you guys for being here with us and looking forward to our conversation today. You know, there's an interesting dynamic that's going on where we're trying to figure out how far do you go when you are trying to protect one's religious belief. There's a concept that's been going on regarding how do you deal with something, for example, that many of society may seem to think it's just a natural part of what they may see as they go through, for example, a cycle as it relates to food and other things that happen in our country. There's a matter regarding the deconstructing of dams to protect salmon, because salmon in certain areas are a sacred animal for certain Native Americans. There's a Native American tribe that views salmon as being a sacred animal. They view it as being something that's important, in particular up in the Pacific Northwest area. Many people in the Northwest understand that the Klamath Falls that are there's a damming process that takes place as it relates to the construction of energy and the production of electricity. But then you also have these tribes that view salmon as being something that's sacred, view it as being something that symbolizes abundance, prosperity, and fertility. And in particular, there's one tribe that's called the Yurok and the Karuk and other native nations that have protested for decades regarding the damming of the Klamath River. And as a result, we have now seen a lot of pushback taking place to the point that now we are starting to hear that in the next quote unquote next cycle of activity, maybe in the next year or so, that these dams are now becoming undammed. In other words, it sounds like all of this conversation and all of this push and the question regarding religious freedom and protection of all seems to be something that has actually made sense and really had some traction that take place. So now we are looking at how far do you go when you're trying to protect one's religious beliefs? You know, Melissa, I look at a case like this, and on one hand, I enjoy the fact that the federal government and state authorities are willing to make changes to adhere to the religious beliefs of certain Native Americans. But on the other hand, the cost of maybe going through a deconstruction taking place with the dam and the possibility of having to do this even more times, I'm beginning to ask myself the question, where do we draw the line in terms of how far you go to protect one's religious freedom? And when are you getting to a point where every time something seems to impact one individual, how do you determine how it impacts everyone else?
Sure. Well, Orlin, I think the state of California made the right decision with this. As you mentioned, it's been a decades-long frustration by these Native American tribes. This is, salmon is both of, a dietary necessity for them. It is also considered a sacred animal in their spiritual tradition. And there is, irrefutable evidence that there has been economic implications because of these dams, because you see the number of salmon has been reduced significantly since these dams have taken place. Unlike other sort of natural or man-made dams or structures, there was not a mechanism put in place when these dams were constructed for the salmon to be able to spawn in that same way. And so I really feel like, this is a good faith request or concern by the population, the Native American population there. Again, they're very upfront about, yes, this is a religious belief or, of ours. This is an animal that we consider sacred. But at the same time, they were very upfront about the economic component and why that was important as well. And I think, we see Native American religious freedom rights probably play out most often here in the United States as far as land and land use. And we see that again in the West with, conversations about oil drilling or building on sacred ground or destruction of things. And again, like when we talk about religious accommodation in the workplace, as we as Seventh-day Adventists often do, we talk about sincerely held beliefs. And I think very correctly, so the U.S. court system has determined that is not an area that it wants to get into, is determining whether or not someone's beliefs are sincerely held, right? They are not the church, and they don't view that as their function. Neither am I. And so if someone is telling me, and I think a decades-long fight is indicative of a sincerely held belief, then I'm going to trust that is the case.
Bettina, what I'm trying to understand here is we've got this belief that this is something that's important from a religious perspective, but it looks like this is also coupled with the idea that there's an economic benefit or a financial plus to this as well. I have to ask myself the question, if the finance wasn't there, would we probably be very comfortable supporting the religious aspect of this? Or is this just one of those things where both sides just happen to benefit and you can kind of just claim victory on both sides of this? Or do we think that somebody was really thinking, the religious belief is the way we really want to go? What's your thought when you heard what was going on here?
Well, what I think is that Native Americans is ostensibly protected. But in reality, the courts have a really difficult time applying religious freedom principles to Native American beliefs. Mm-hmm. And that's because, you have all these theistic religions like Islam and Christianity and Judaism, and there's certain similarities in the forms. Like they all worship in a special building. They all have their own liturgies and way of worshiping, which the content is different, but the form is very similar. And then you have the Native Americans coming along and saying, well, we just don't fit that mold. And so our religious freedom claims kind of seem out there. They seem like a pretext. And, you think of the economic benefit and you say, oh, this is just a pretext. They're not genuine. As Melissa pointed out, there's this skepticism. So I think what we need to do is to understand that religious freedom and the exercise of it doesn't need to look the same for everyone. And if we try to fit it into that sort of Judeo-Christian mold, we're going to be disadvantaging religious minorities. There's a case, Employment Division versus Smith, which involved a Native American practice of smoking peyote, a controlled substance. Mm-hmm. This is back in the 1990s. The court upended religious freedom protection because it wasn't prepared to embrace that Native American practice and protect it. In the end, it actually undermined religious freedom rights for everyone, including Christians, including mainstream religious faiths. So my thinking is, let's protect religious minorities as robustly as we can because it benefits everyone in the long term.
Carmela, I understand that if someone is genuine and someone is sincere, those are some great and noble characteristics to have. But even though you may be sincere, you may be genuine about your belief in spaghetti or pirates or chicken or whatever the case may be, when do we as a society come to the conclusion that I understand your sincerity, I understand your genuineness, but this has gone a little bit too far based on our societal norms that we have established over the last couple hundred years? Is there a place for that type of conversation when we're thinking about these type of topics?
Yeah, I think we're starting to learn how to have these conversations. We do not now, but perhaps we're starting to have those sort of deeper conversations. You look like a man who enjoys a little salmon, but let's talk a little bit about what it is when it is your culture and as part of your religious rights. And what I think is very interesting about this case is the specific religious beliefs here, notwithstanding, there is an environmental an economic catastrophe that's happening around the use of salmon. You have to know the salmon's lifestyle and how they work, or life cycle, and how they go from one spawning point all the way out to the ocean and back again. How do they go back again if you've dammed up the rivers and you've dammed up the waterways? And how does a community of native tribes, First Nations people, and how do they get the opportunity to fish, as was outlined under treaties over 150 years ago, if you dam up and take control of the riverways? So it seems as though that a more heartfelt and sincere recognition of different peoples, their cultures, their practices would have helped us out a long time ago. Now we're looking at an environmental and economic catastrophe that deals with waterways, our food sources, jobs, and energy, and so many other things.
But Lawrence, the whole purpose of this damming up process was really to cut down the cost of electricity in the northwestern part of the United States. You know, Klamath Falls is probably one of the biggest generators of power that they utilize there in an environmentally safe way. So there was some real benefits for that happened to draw in this whole issue regarding the salmon. When you try to juxtapose against those two things, which side is society supposed to pick? It's like you don't know who to root for sometimes.
Well, you know, a colleague of mine once said to me, we don't mean to do harm, we just do it. And unfortunately, over and over again, that's the reality of the situation. You know, we're so focused and so locked in on a certain objective and outcome that we fail to grasp the bigger picture. Today, almost nobody listening to this program could envision a world where when you're on your way to the supermarket or you're leaving the airport with your roller bag, no one can envision not having that cutaway on the sidewalk where you can just roll down without being a gymnast. But there once was a time in this country when the force of law did not mandate that had to be the case. And so today we are all the beneficiaries of the fact that in looking out for our disabled population, this was something that had to be done. Should time last, I would like to think we will eventually get to a place where we look back on some of these issues and fights and say, why did it take so much time for us to figure this out? You know, everybody that sits down with a little lemon and a little butter and has a good time with a piece of salmon should appreciate that when we look out for the rights of a few of us, we ultimately end up looking out for the rights of many of us. And that's really how it ought to be.
I'm gonna have to let that be the last word, but I think the more tolerant we become as a society regarding those things that maybe we don't understand initially, the better our society is going to be. And hopefully we'll see more of this type of activity down the road. You know, the adoption of foster kids is one of the things that we see happening in the United States that probably is one of the most important things that we can engage in. There's a court case that's called Burke versus Walsh, in which you have Mike and Kitty Burke, who are a couple from Massachusetts that wanted to welcome in children into their family. They applied to become foster parents. They wanted to care for vulnerable children who were in need and searching for a loving home. They were denied their ability to basically have foster children come into their home because their religious viewpoints did not align with some of the quote unquote issues of marriage and sexuality that the state of Massachusetts thought they should have been more comfortable with. So when they applied to become parents, they had to go under all of these hours of training in which they completed them successfully. And then basically their instructor reported that they were going to be positive contributions to this whole program of foster children, but then they were eventually denied because they had expressed that they did not have the kind of openness as it related to opening up their children to the idea of understanding what's going on with same-sex marriage and transgender and things of that nature, and all of a sudden the process ended for them. You know, Lawrence, when we see that in our society, one of the most important things that we can be doing is looking out for vulnerable children, and then to see that there's a family who's willing to make this step, and are told that you cannot move forward and do so because you're unwilling to basically start thinking about potential impacts as it relates to sexuality on children that you're bringing into your home. And for some reason, we're seeing more of these type of decisions taking place across the country. And it is making me wonder, are we still looking out for the best interests of children, or are we simply looking out for the best interests of whatever the political establishment may be in a particular jurisdiction? I mean, what are your thoughts on that, Lawrence? And where do you think we're going with this?
So there are a number of troubling things about this. You know, we live in a time now where a Democrat will assume that a Republican is not ready to operate in best interest, and a Republican will assume that a Democrat is just way out in left field. You have a couple that did everything they were asked to do. Mm-hmm. Not most, not much, everything. Not only did they do everything that they were asked to do, but they even demonstrated the capacity, and this is important because some people don't have capacity. These folks demonstrated the capacity to be able to say, listen, we have a belief system, we feel a certain way about these things, but that does not preclude us from being able to create a safe space in our home for children who may think this way or be this way. Now, that's important. That's important. Because for me, there are a lot of things that I believe in, some things I even believe strongly. But one of my superpowers is the ability and the capacity to understand that everybody in this world does not think like I do. And even though I think I'm right almost all the time, the reality is sometimes I'm not right. And so by having the ability to leave room for how other people think, how other people feel, it makes me a better person, I think. And so you have a couple here that was able to demonstrate we can take these children in our home. They will feel loved. They will feel cared for. And even though our belief system is divergent from how some of them may be, we still are able to create a good space for them. And the state still looked at them and said, thanks, but no thanks. And that's a problem because too often when things are breaking the other way, you don't find this same reticence. And I'm like, listen, folks, we need to create a situation here where as long as certain markers, certain boxes are checked, we need to be able to move forward. That didn't happen here. And it bothers me that it didn't happen here because fairness doesn't work for anybody unless it works for everybody.
Orlin, can I add to what Lawrence has just said here? What is crazy about this case is that it's taking place against a background of a critical shortage of foster homes across our nation. I mean, half of all states last year experienced a significant decline in the number of available foster homes. And so because of what Lawrence has identified here, this sort of unreasoning, knee-jerk, sort of extreme approach to this issue, a loving family has been counted out of this pool of potential foster families. You know, let's not sugarcoat what happens to children who aren't adequately cared for within foster systems. I mean, these children go missing at a significantly higher rate than other children in the community. And missing children are more vulnerable to sexual exploitation and human trafficking. This is a serious issue. This is not something to play ideological or political football with.
You know, Carmela, when I look at a story like this and you say to yourself that the real line here was, are we looking out for the kids or are we looking out for an agenda regarding sexuality? And it looks like the agenda regarding sexuality wins. You know, when I think all of us who've been trained in some of these areas has thought it was always what's in the best interest of the children, but it looks like that's just been thrown out of the door like the baby with the bathwater here on this. You know, when you hear this type of story, what are your thoughts on this?
Oh, Orla, this you're right. Some of us, we have been trained in this. And this was particularly my area when I did practice law: child abuse, neglect, and dependency, foster care, and adoption. So I have mixed feelings about this case. On one hand, obviously, they had the flexibility, they had the discretion to see that this was a family that could handle this and could both take care of the children and sort of ease, at least for the number of children that would be placed in their home, could ease some of this problem, right? They had the flexibility to determine this. On the other hand, there was some information. So we don't know for sure that this is a loving, and I'm not saying that they're not, but we don't know how it's going to play out. And we don't know how it's going to turn out with the children. This is such an eventuality. We don't know if they were actually going to have children, if the Burkeses were going to actually have children who identified as gay, lesbian, transgender, or anything. We don't know. And so this is such a hypothetical situation to have been cut short at the beginning of the process, for one thing, which makes this conversation really kind of sad. But on the other hand, yes, it seems as though they wondered, how would we deal with something like this? You know, the wife, Kitty, talked about how she didn't believe that people should be able to choose their pronouns. Well, how's that going to happen, or how's that going to work when you have a teenager into your home that has pronouns that you don't think that they should be using? These were some things that you have to look at, and you have to look at it very carefully. I don't agree with a blanket rule that says if you're a Christian or you're a religious person, that should not come into it, but you have to look at it very carefully.
Well, Melissa, I don't know how we kind of look at this, because at the end of the day, I understand that there's certain things that you want to make sure that people are open to, depending on what happens down the road. But this future consideration piece seems to be such an extrapolation, or, such a possibility of what might happen, that we don't even get a chance to even begin the assistance process, because we've already prejudged maybe where this process is going to be 10 or 15 years down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. It's frustrating. I think, again, we're talking about a hypothetical situation, and it sounds like this couple are being penalized for being honest about their own belief system. Not, again, what their practice would be with this hypothetical child that was experiencing, this situation, but actually what their own beliefs were. They were told by the state of Massachusetts that their religious beliefs were basically invalid, and therefore disqualified them for being foster parents. And again, as Bettina said, in a time of crisis for the foster care system. I mean, we're reading about these children in Massachusetts, foster care children in Massachusetts, sleeping in hospitals. And yet we want to deny a couple who, again, have checked all of the other boxes. This is not the only conversation that they had. They were screened rigorously, and this was the thing that completely disqualified them.
But we also have heard, for example, that the Catholic Charities Organization, that were involved in a lot of things along the lines of adoption and taking care of children, that once they were told that you also have to be comfortable in putting these children in the home of same-sex marriages or same-sex relationships, that the Catholic Church said, listen, that's beyond what we believe, we're out. But then in the same breath, you start thinking, well, are the children, quote unquote, better off in those circumstances than being in some of these other places? So it makes me ask the question, does it depend on what is specifically happening in a household that can make someone comfortable, maybe someone not comfortable? Lawrence, I see you got this on your lips. Get it out, man. Get it out.
You see, this is the very thing I'm talking about, because at some point we have to ask the question, what's the greater harm? What's the greater good? Everybody's not going to believe like I believe, and we need to be okay with that. I'm not offended. I'm not off-put by somebody who has a different take on things. I don't wear my heart on my sleeve to that extent, and the fact is that if you ask a child who's in a very messed up situation, are you willing to be in a situation, whether it's temporary or for an extended period, are you willing to be in a situation where your quality of life is going to be better as opposed to what you're dealing with right now, I dare say most of those children would say, you know what? I can deal with two mommies. I can deal with two daddies better than I can deal with sleeping on the street.
And I guess that's where we find ourselves trying to draw the line, trying to understand, how do we not allow our personal agendas or our religious agendas in some instances, or our agenda to want society to be broken up and rearranged in a different way to take the lead? When you start thinking about children, when you start thinking about their livelihood and their welfare and things of that nature, there has to be a balance of some sort. But I also understand that there are parts of society that believe that some of the beliefs that we have from a religious standpoint should supersede all else. And if it's not superseding all else, then that's a problem for them. So I don't know what the exact answer needs to be. I'm somebody who thinks that you've got to look out for the welfare of children, but I also understand that different lifestyles are where we are in this society. And if we don't understand that that's where we're going to be, we're probably going to find ourselves fighting about these type of things for now and into the very near future. Hey, Lawrence, tell me something I don't know.
A marathon is run over 26 miles. But did you know that when salmon are spawning, in any given day, they can swim up to 31 miles or more in an effort to get to their destination? And many times their route requires them to jump 6 feet or more to clear certain obstacles. Now, that's something to think about when you break out that lemon and butter.
Thank you, Lawrence. Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
Okay, Orlin, did you know that there is an extinct species of salmon called the saber-toothed salmon, which, if you look at the fossilized remains, it's as scary and as terrifying as the name suggests.
Never seen that one before, nor heard of it. Carmela, tell me something I don't know.
I have lots of salmon facts, but Bettina mentioned peyote earlier on, and you've heard of peyote. You've heard of ayahuasca as that special psychedelic brew that people use in different churches. But have you heard about a Detroit church called Soul Tribes that was offering psilocybin and mushrooms and membership at $20 a pop, which is still trying to figure out what's going to happen with them, whether or not this is an actual sacrament or just a drug deal masquerading as a church.
Wow. Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
Yeah, Orlin, I'm going to a salmon fact too. So did you know that salmon can range in size from 3 pounds to 126 pounds? So much like human beings, they're sort of across the scale.
Wasn't aware of that at all. Guys, I appreciate the conversation today and obviously the information on salmon. I appreciate that as well. Thanks for being here with us today. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.